Today's book, DSP and the Lost Tomes of Goutopia by Paul Werkema. DSP and the Lost Tomes of Goutopia. It had been a day since the last ray of hope faded from the piglet's world. He had not moved since the Infinity Hoof was destroyed by the alternate reality version of himself. The King of Lying could only mumble about how he had been wronged by the world, and especially Tervine. He could not do anything. There was nothing he could do. He did everything correct despite all his efforts. He was undermined by evil people. Granted, the reason he could not move was because his limbs were atrophied to the point of uselessness, and he could not motivate himself to try and do anything. Out of nowhere, the hole in reality, which Lightside Phil had created earlier, was torn open again, and Cydella was tossed through it. Lightside Phil stepped out, and with sadness in his eyes, he told Cydella that his behavior would not be tolerated in the Lightside universe. God damn, it's like getting to the... It's like looking at... Oh man, it's like skipping all the individual stories, like the important ones, not like Ant-Man, but like Captain America and shit, and jumping right in, and we get to enjoy Thanos, the aftermath of fucking Thanos. What the fuck? The taint of hate was too deep in him, and he could not be redeemed yet, but there was still hope for him to turn around if he wanted to do so. LSP gave Cydella a hug, a $25 gift card to Snortbucks, and a balloon that had a smiling sun on it. The last bit of wisdom LSP tried to impart on Cydella was how he had to do something to repent for all of his really stupid and hurtful things Cydella had done in his life. With a hint of sadness in his eye, LSP turned around and walked back to his universe, with and the hole in reality slowly closed behind him, stranding the former captain of the Participation Award-winning Goutopian Cavalry in the Dark Side universe. The room went dark again, as the shimmering rays of hope coming from Lightside universe vanished from this world. Cydella looked over at his former father figure, with a look of dejection, a flicker of salt, and a gout rippled through the King of Rage Quit's eyes, as his worm-like lips twisted into a horrid grin. As another scheme crept into his demented mind, DSP let out a thunderous snort and demanded Cydella carry him out of the salt caves and back to his fortress, forgetting the fact that it was in total ruins. With a whimper and a hint of joy at having been given some level of recognition from his father figure, and the only person that he sees as his friend, Cydella scrambled to put the piglet into his former wheelchair and pushed him out of the cave over the course of a few hours. The entire time, the King of Entitlement complained about how long it was taking for him to be pushed out of the cave. He demanded a feast of fast food be brought to him, as well as completely ignoring the fact that he only had one of his cultists left, also the sorry state of his finances. The steep angle of the mine prevented the piglet from making a quick escape from his place. It didn't help matters that most of his cult had abandoned him to his fate. Even the golden cults seemed to have just disappeared, even though he had been just outside the cave when they were forced to go into this place by the detractors finding the sign outside. He thought about sending out a tweet, begging for help, but the ridicule he would receive was just too much for him at the moment. The piglet thought about how his security had failed him, and came to the conclusion of it all being Tevin's fault. If it wasn't for the fact some of his cultists telling him occasionally of Tevin's existence, mind which was swimming in gin would have forgotten all of this. I like how we're talking about anime chat. It seems like a better topic than whatever this is. After nearly 6 hours of struggling, the two of them had emerged from the cave and reached the ruins of the swine fort. The King of Inflammation looked around and angrily demanded to know why everything was still in ruins. Cydella stammered that there was no one left, as far as he knew, to rally support to rebuild his kingdom. DSP let out another thunderous snort, cleared his throat, and ordered Cydella to bring forth his mod so he could have a meeting with them and devise a plan to find a solution to his problems. After he placed the piglet into his former love seat of power, Sidella wheeled himself over to the great horn of Goutopia, and with all his strength, let loose the call for the mods to assemble. At first, nothing happened, because the horn was clogged with crap, because let's be honest, DSP never cleaned it. The first attempt blew a toxic cloud of gout, salt, and dust, while the next few tries yielded similar results. The piglet was getting very fidgety, and was rocking side to side at an accelerating rate which matched the rage building inside him. Finally, the call went out, and the two of them waited for whoever was left to come, and maybe help the dotard and his dullard in their quest for the lost Tomes of Goutopia. Hey, they said the line! They said the line, big ups. These mythic books had been written by one of DSP's friends after being guilted into do it for the piglet for free. They were said to have stained with the holy salt and tomato Kool-Aid from the authentic recipe passed down from the Italian side of the pig's family. They traced the origins from the small Italian town of what? Chocholo? Chocholo. Okay. Which is no way located in Poland. I guess it's an actual city, maybe. Don't look for it on a map on Poland because it won't be there. Okay, I guess it's not a city. The piglet was very clear the location of this town is in Italy, possibly the center of it. If you question this, piglet will use the hate generated from this to propel himself into further failure. They waited for about 10 minutes. The king of uncleanliness bemoaned the amount of time it was taking his cultists to assemble and claimed they had been waiting for hours. Sidella thought about pointing out only 10 minutes had passed, but he didn't want to be banned again. His various reincarnations had all been struck down, and he only had so many accounts he could flee to. The Twitch sirens were wise to him and would descend upon him to smite his next account, and he would have nowhere to go. The piglet knew this, and was using it to keep him around. When Goutopia eventually dissipated into the forgotten histories of all things to be used as a way to learn not to do as a person, Sidella would either go away or try to latch on to someone else. Finally, in the distance, a few figures could be seen making their way across the salty, toxic plains of northern Goutopia. It wasn't exactly the king of depression had hoped for. The two individuals are Snow Carl and that Anonymous. Oh, big ups. Hey, somebody tell Anonymous he has a shout out in this book. Little did he know. One of his friend and another was Mephistopheles, inspired figure who only wanted to draw the anger and the rage from the king of Rage Quit, which could only cause him to spiral into a pit of his own failure. Piglet knew this, however, he was powerless to stop it, because of his own inadequacies to see what was coming. This seemed to be all that the cult of the pig had left to offer to aid their beggar king in his time of need. The army of the king of abandonment was hoping for wasn't coming, and he had to try and do what he could with those who were around him. Unfortunately, this wasn't someone who could work with the tools at hand, and instead launched into a tantrum of thunderous snorts and complaints about how people were just being lazy. Snowcarl agreed with him, and claimed that he had tried to rally further support, but no one else was willing to come because of the failures in the pig's life. The rage built inside the piglet, and his hoof hovered above the dreaded ban button. However, something stayed his hoof, and prevented him from getting rid of Snowcarl here and now. Dude, it's not no, it's now. What the fuck? That Anonymous didn't say anything about what was said and told the King of Debt that no one else was coming. He continued by asking if they were going on a quest for something to save what was left of the kingdom. Snowcarl added that the remnants of the decrepit kingdom would need a great power to save it, and questioned if the piglet could get the power before the detractors could. The mention of the detractors brought images of heaven into DSP's mind, causing fear to grip his weak heart. His bladder quickly emptied, like an animal trying to make itself lighter so it could flee faster from danger. The King of Cowardice attempted to put on a brave face in the presence of his remaining loyalists. The constant needling of Snow Carl would have been tolerated if he was going to regain the support he had in the times of milk and honey. The king of backbiting began to furiously rock in his love seat, and a rapey grin slithered across his face. He let out a triumphant snort. I don't even know if you could hear that of the noise gate. Fuck that one up. I snorted, goddammit, and I don't want to hit the snort button. Hold on. He let out a triumphant snort and proclaimed that they would be traveling to the south, where his former palace in Connecticut were, where he hid the second greatest weapon he had. The three cultists looked at each other and questioned why the king of poor planning hadn't used this weapon to save the kingdom all that time ago. But this thought was quickly forgotten, as the Pignosis still had a hold on them. The king of embellishment continued by explaining they were looking at the lost Tomes of Power, which could be used to recreate the Salt and Gout stones. The king of sloth set his cultists off to construct a grand cart so he wouldn't have to touch the ground. Before the dark times of the taxings and the Twitch Sirens invasion, the piglet was carried around on a grand golden cart, which cost his many thousands of dollars. Unfortunately, it was torn apart and carried off to pay for the debts the king of instability had accrued while gambling on the imaginary gladiator fights. The true reasons of the cart's disappearance was one of the many things the pig had tried to hide from the cult so they wouldn't think he was losing power. Other carts were purchased in an attempt to keep up his image, and to show that he was trying to cut back on his rampant spending or random cosmetic changes. Now there was no reason to hide these things, and the King of Gout sent Sidella and that Anonymous off to gather the needed materials. After a few minutes, he was becoming impatient, because the cart hadn't suddenly appeared, and he wanted to go on the quest now. Snow Carl crept up next to his love seat, and in a ghost-like whisper informed the king of excess of the cart's inability to hold both his sizable girth and the love seat. Rage poured from the pig's sewer-like mouth as he angrily berated Sidella and Donna and Animaus for not properly building the cart to its exact specifications. The two looked at each other, questioning if they were ever given any instructions on constructing this cart, but due to the intense pignosis, they seemingly came to the conclusion they must have been, and fear ran through them, as they began to worry about being banned if they didn't build this right. With them doubling their efforts to build the cart in the way of the king of manipulation demanded, as the cart was nearing completion, Snow Carl again whispered in the ear of the pigroach about how there were things that were called 18-wheeler, and his cart with only 4 would look less prestigious when compared to others. Jesus Christ, this is like the snort bucks all over again. Where is it? A panicked DSP's gout-ridden mind began to stew on the words of Snow Carl. The word made sense in some confusing way. He had heard of these 18-wheelers, but his gin-fueled mind couldn't recall what they were or what they looked like. Finally, his pride took over and demanded 15 wheels be added to his cart so it could be seen as more prestigious, even though the design changes made no sense. Sidella and then Anonymous set to work on these additional changes to this cart, which was most likely going to have to be pulled by Sidella and that Anonymous. Once again, Snow Carl approached the piglet. However, this time, he was met with the full salty wrath of the King of Hate. He had berated Snow Carl for his trollish ways and attempting to sow dissent within the cult. This action would only be tolerated 13 or 14 more times, and then he would pay for the transactions against him. I think he meant transgressions. Oh. Snow Carl looked confused and hurt at these accusations and claimed he was only trying to be positive, contribute to the cult. This apology seemed to ease the paranoia of the piglet, but the true reason for Snow Carl approaching him this time wasn't to manipulate change into the design of the new pig carrier. Snow Carl told him that they should seek cover before the King of Ignorance could ask why a barrage of potatoes rained down upon them. Another raiding party of Ketzonians descended upon them. They pummeled the pathetic pig with a plethora of potato and potato-related products. What? Oh, God. Okay. Okay. Okay, I guess the what do they call them? The Ketzonians and the potato weapons. The only thing the piglet could do was curl up in the fetal position and pray his attackers would just pity him and move on. This maneuver had worked time and time again in high school, as those mean jocks on the basketball, football, wrestling, swimming, gymnastics, tennis, cross-country, sailing, glee, debate, chess, and Magic the Gathering teams would mock him. Granted, his paper-thin hide and layers of blubber wouldn't be able to absorb all the blows, but this might cause them to turn their attention to one of the other targets. Yeah, it don't matter. If he's doing the same thing, he's doing a skit. It's a fake LTG that does a skit. He was in a couple other streams. He just does this thing and he regurgitates something. I don't know. It's like a weird spam thing, but I don't understand what the spam is supposed to be about, so I just kind of ignore it. Let's see. Idella was pelted with baked potatoes. That Anonymous was tangled in a twisted web of curly fries and drug off into the distance. The King of Salt was covered in scalloped potatoes, which not only burned through the protective layer of grease, but also the first layer of fat on his sickly body. It also absorbed some of the life-giving salt that the pig was made of. As the Ketzonians rode off, their Jasper Tiger hybrids towards the gym where Cat and Jim reside. The piglet looked around his now even more ruined camp. Idella was on one of his many incel forums explaining how these women had wronged him. A visibly shaken Don Anonymous was walking back and didn't want to talk about what happened. Snow Carl, on the other hand, was untouched. This bothered the pig. But he had other things that he needed to deal with. The king of Purblind's tired gaze fell on Snow Carl as he stood unfazed, untouched by the assault of the Ketzonians. Paranoid thoughts came about Snow Carl's being an agent of one of his many enemies entered his gin-fueled mind. He couldn't discover how or why the wrath of the second queen of Goutopia, when the pig roach had been humiliated again by her warriors. This had to be Tevin's doing. He must have turned Cat against him, just like he had done with Panda of Not Asia. Now he planted Snow Carl here to further humiliate him and cause more pain and suffering. Slowly, Snow Carl glided over to the side of the piglet and asked him if he was okay. The pig recoiled from the near human contact and looked over to that Anonymous and Idella for them to intervene. However, they were busy dealing with the psychological trauma of being temporarily abducted by the Ketzonians, or they were furiously justifying why those women should treat him correctly. Snow Carl looked around the camp and the cart and grinned at the king of Credulous and whispered that there was an evil person in his group, but that he would have to find out who and take care of them. They needed to find PW Dubs, so that the numbers would be on their side in case the other two turned against him. The pasty white hide of the piglet somehow became much whiter at the suggestion that one of his few remaining followers was working against him. He had just thought that, in fact, with a shaky hoof, he reached for the holy bottle of gin and took a long gulp from it. It was followed by an equally long gulp from the sacred cherry juice. The sore and deteriorating eyes of the piglet glared at the others as he wondered why they weren't checking up on him. The king of retching unleashed a thunderous snort that snapped his followers to attention. He demanded that he and his well-loved loveseat be placed in the new cart so their quest can begin. Idella jumped up, scampered over to the loveseat, and strained to lift it up. Then Anonymous hesitated and then moved over to help Idella. This was exactly what Snow Carl wanted to happen, but he wouldn't act on this right away. The piglet noticed as well and began to question everything that he had ever said. Strange edits were being made inside the pig's mind as things were being misremembered and actions of others were associated with that anonymous. The deterioration of his mind was causing him to question everything. His hoof hovered closer and closer to the ban button, and he thought the spy might be that anonymous. Seeing this, Snow Carl whispered now wasn't the time. They still needed him in case they ran into more trouble. This swayed the piglet, and he went back to rocking forward and backward on his love seat, nearly falling multiple times, as his two loyal cultists struggled to get the love seat into the cart. After many hours of struggling to get the plump piglet and his disgusting love seat into the cart, they finally achieved this. Snow Carl hopped into the back of the cart and perched himself on the back, so he could continue to whisper into the pig's gouty ear. Another thunderous snort, and a vomit-inducing throat clear, and called that anonymous and Sidella to the front of the cart, and they began to pull it towards the south. The king of overweening demanded they double their pace, so they could make it to the southern Goutopia before his enemies could know what his intentions were. He then tweeted out his intentions and posed them on the King of Doxing forum. Sasha, I'm gonna read your stuff afterwards. I'm letting you know that right now. Your shit's afterwards. Oh man. The wheels of the pork cart creaked under the excessive weight of the King of Corrupulent. His well-loved love seat and Snow Carl was perched to continue his machinations. That Anonymous and Sidella struggled to get any momentum due to the deplorable conditions of the roads. In one of his many gin-fueled rants, the piglet had declared pavement to be unnatural and banned paved roads from his kingdom. His cultists spent years trying to rid northern Goutopia of all paved roads, until a rare moment of sobriety happened and the king of this dipsomaniac angrily ordered them to repave the roads. This never happened with the exception of the Great Goutway that connected North and South Goutopia. This was the road that the piglet and his cult used to fleece the southern Goutopia, when the followers of Kojima and the early critics invaded his land. Some say this was the fall of southern Goutopia, but this was only part of it, as those called the Talented Ones had been unknowingly chipping away at the kingdom when things get hard and the piglet gets lazy, and then scared, and then scampered away. As the day went on, the pig roach grew impatient. With the lack of progress they were making, he began to squirt them with his water bottle of shame, and demanded they speed up before he was forced to thrash them. So Carl leaned in and whispered about them needing proper motivation if they were to go faster. Also, just the water bottle wasn't going to be enough to make them go faster. He also muttered about how there were only 2 people because the piglet had chased away all of his cultists, and might want to think about another way to travel south or get rid of the love seat. DSP unleashed an angry snort and declared that he was running out of patience with Snow Carl. He then launched into a 20-minute rant about all the things he was going to insert into Snow Carl's behind if this didn't stop. Oh. He went into the great lengths describing that I personally don't feel like typing it out because I don't want to have to burn a layer of skin off my fingers and wash my eyes with bleach. As the rant came to an end, Snow Carl and Mouse looked at each other, back at the piglet with a look of general disgust. Sidella looked slightly turned on. After an uncomfortable amount of time, Snow Carl said that they should keep moving before they get caught by one of the many roving bands of the raiders looking for the remaining assets of the northern Goutopia. Aside from the Quetzonians, there were also the Taxings, the Raiders, and the Mid-First Mountain Range. The Mid-First Mountain Range mercenaries. And the CT Bank. It's not Citibank. It's like, look here, look, listen, see. and various adventurers seeking here to explore what was left of this once respectable yet horribly flawed kingdom. There was also the risk of some other enemy to manifest itself in order to torment the pig roach. It took him most of the day before they finally reached the Goutway and started heading north. They were using a map that DSP was looking at upside down, and they just went with it because it was better to do what they knew was right than to have to deal with the piglet snorting, squealing, and flailing about. I'm going to need to take a sip. I'm not going to be able to survive this. Let's see. The temper tantrums were growing more pathetic and frequent as the decline of Goutopia became more and more severe. On the Goutway, they passed several large groups of refugees, fleeing to either one of the many Twitch sirens, or they were going to some place to start their own lives. This seemed to anger the king of priggishness, as he unleashed a string of thunderous snorts and began another angry rant about sodomy and mental health. This came to a sudden halt when his notoriously terrible eyesight caught the image of a reporter with a camera crew. The king of paranoia started shaking and letting terrified snorts escape his snout as a reporter interviewed the many refugees fleeing from his ruined cities of Goutopia. It might have also been the scantily clad Twitch sirens who were attempting to entice the former cultists to join one of the many city-states that were there. Many were following them, while some were ignoring them and continuing either the land of Mixer or fleeing. Oh yeah, you remember that place? Either the land of Mixer or YouTubers. Oh, you could have added a period here. Snow Carl whispered that several of the Twitch sirens were smiling at the piglet, which only made him more uncomfortable. As he recoiled from the possibility of someone touching him, the sight of the piglet becoming more and more afraid and uncomfortable gave Snow Carl an idea. Jeez, this is killing me. One sec. Try not to like fucking choke. It's like non-stop. Let's see. Blah, blah, blah. Twitch sirens were smiling at Piglet, which only made him more uncomfortable as he recoiled from the possibility of someone touching him. The sight of the piglet became more and more afraid and uncomfortable. Gave Snow Carl an idea. He called over to the reporter. This reporter turned out to be GTG, with Asian GTG as his cameraman. Kenny and his boom mic operator, that's not, you just put the name Mike, you didn't even put MIC. And an unnamed female intern. They all approached at the makeshift cart. GTG asked the piglet how he felt knowing that everyone was fleeing northern Goutopia. The king of Witless channeled his inner Idi Ahmed and summoned the little confidence and intelligence he had and declared that his good brain would lead Goutopia back to glory because he is the master of all that is, all the fish on the land and the beast in the sea. The GTG thought about making sense of that, but just decided to move on to the next question about where the piglet was going. The king of mindlessness declared he wouldn't tell some brain-dead detractor that he was heading back to the Connecticut condo to find the lost Tomes of Goutopia, which would explain how to recreate the salt and gout stones. GTG rubbed his temples and explained to the dense dotard he had just told him and all of his viewers where they were going. DSP exclaimed he was wrong, and he hadn't done that. Sidella immediately agreed with his master, while Snow Carl and Don Anonymous looked dumbfounded at the two of them. Asian GTG and Kenny just said wow in response, and the unnamed female intern vomited a bit as she accidentally looked at the piglet. Oh, just looked at the piglet. GTG rolled his eyes and said he thinks he got everything he needed. However, the king of looser lips continued by saying the detractors were never going to be able to follow the highly detailed map that he emailed to all of them as a diversion while posting the real map of how to get there on his forums, using the fake name not_DSP. Adela added that he further hid the real map by sending in a DM to every detractor. GTG, Snow Carl, that anonymous, Asian GTG, Kenny, and the unnamed female intern. Wait, what? There was no... Dude, put a period. You can't... Oh. Okay, just send it to a DM to every detractor. Then GTG, Snow Carl, that anonymous, Asian GTG, Kenny, and the unnamed female intern all tried to tell him to stop talking and asked him if he knew this was being recorded. Again, DSP boasted that he wouldn't be able to be stopped. He wouldn't be able to be stopped by any of them. In the 3 places they plan on stopping to refill their gin, which are clearly marked on the maps that were sent to them. Just like run this through Word. Just, Paul, I know one day you're gonna listen to this, maybe, but just run this shit through Word first. Just the bare minimum. Because when you don't have periods and shit and stuff's all over the place, I can't tell where a sentence ends or begins. Like there's no breaks, no nothing. After basically explaining where they were going and how they were planning to get there, the pig's cart was on the move again, leaving a stunned GTG and company. I'm not reading all their names. To upload what they had recorded. It dawned on the piglet about 20 minutes later, and he had done what he had done and started to sweat profusely. Snow Carl and that anonymous attempted to explain to him that it was his own fault, but Thydella reassured him that those brain-dead idiots had tricked him into revealing their plans. Capitalizing on this, Snow Carl whispered in the pig's gout-infested ear that the best thing he could do would be to continue on their path. At this point, the piglet was about 6 gin and tonics deep in his own sorrow, and agreed that he must continue on this path. The gin was hitting the piglet hard as he was ranting and complaining about everything. They were going too slow, his back hurt, his gout was acting up, his ear was sore, his eyes hurt, and neither of his former queens could fill the John Rambo-sized hole in his heart. And the path they were on was too bumpy. So Carl leaned in and whispered that if they just stayed to the Goutway path, it wouldn't be so rough. The king of backbiting snorted and accused Snow Carl of insisting they changed their plans, and now was telling him that it was the wrong thing to do. Snow Carl backed up in shock and said he was only trying to give the piglet sound advice. The piglet began to shake, and his gnarled, gout-infested hoof hovered over the ban button. Seeing this, Snow Carl turned the situation into his advantage and declared that it was actually that Anonymous's plan. He was the one who had suggested that we should take this route, and he simply relayed it to the piglet. His feet started to rock forward and back at the rage salt and gin began to mix inside his horrendously toxic gut. His disturbing nostrils flared like he was attempting to puff smoke out of them. Finally, the anger and confusion and the stupidity reached the volatile mix. The piglet erupted like a gouty volcano and berated that Anonymous for choosing this path, which was much longer than if they had stayed on the Goutway. He questioned the loyalty of his former mod and called him one of the many brain-dead detractors who was trying to ruin his life. The cart came to an abrupt stop as something inside that Anonymous snapped. He had reached his limit of putting up with the piglet's misdirected anger. He was tired of being the punching bag, and occasionally the therapist for the many psychological issues that the piglet seemed to have. Mustering all of his courage, he turned around to face the piglet and could see that the mirrored portrait of Dorian Gray after years of hedonistic behavior. No longer did he see something that he wanted to be. That Anonymous could see DSP as a pathetic waste of purifying pork that everyone outside the cult of the pig knew him to be. He glared at him and said if the piglet had a problem with him, then go ahead and ban him. Thydella was in shock at what was happening and looked back and forth between the two of them. One was the father figure and the picture of what he wished he could be, the bigger king, and the other was someone who he thought he had been a friend in, that Anonymous. He also saw Snow Carl with a sinister grin, like his plan was working to perfection. He wanted to say something, but that was too weak. Or no, he was too weak to open his mouth, and the pignosis still had its rusty hooks in him. There was nothing he could do. He was doing everything correctly. And by staying silent, he couldn't block the anger. It was Tevin's fault. The piglet's worm-like lips twisted into a vile grin as he knew what was going to happen next. His shaky hoof hovered closer to the ban button. Mustering all of his underdeveloped lungs' ability, he used his authoritative snort and attempted to yell out that Anonymous was banned. His hoof slammed down on the button. His head flopped back on the love seat. A very disturbing groan escaped his mouth. His body trembled for a moment, and then the piglet passed out. That Anonymous looked around and shrugged. He walked away towards the Twitch sirens. Sidella looked around and just started to pull the cart in the direction the piglet had told him to. The King of Sloth slumbered in his love seat after receiving the ecstasy of being able to ban someone. Sidella and Snowcarl pretended to not hear the moans of John and Rambo's name and the occasional panic cries of "Don't leave me, money." There were other things that escaped the piglet's festering sewer of a mouth, which caused his two remaining companions to give each other sideways glances, chuckle at what he said, and question if they heard what he had just said. Nothing seemed to awaken the piglet's sleep, even when the cart tipped over, causing the king of roaches to tumble down a rather steep hill. It was like the pig roach was in a gout-induced coma, if that had even been possible. After almost a day of hard travel, the piglet began to stir, and through his degenerating eyes, he saw that he had travels that he saw the had travels off. What? Okay, he saw that they had traveled off the Goutway. That's probably what he means to put in here. They had traveled off the Goutway and into the wilderness of northern Goutopia. The icy hand of fear gripped the fragile sense of security the king of paranoia had. He realized there were only 3 of them now, and only one there was only one he could really trust, was his royal dullard Sidella. Gelatinous jowls swung about wildly as he looked around like a 4-year-old who got separated from his parents at a theme park. Immediately he was coated in a thick layer of terrified sweat. His bladder had emptied, and in a high-pitched voice, much like a child seeing a horror movie for the first time and not realizing it's not actually real. In rapid succession, the pig roach asked where that Anonymous was. Why, they had moved off the Goutway. Had Tevin found them? And if the taxings were coming for his few remaining possessions? Sidella began to stammer and lock up over the fear that he would be the next one to be banned. Snowcarl looked at Sidella and saw that he was too afraid to tell the piglet what he had done. A sinister grin crossed Snowcarl's face, and he whispered something into the King of Ignorance's ear that Sidella couldn't hear. The piglet somehow or another turned whiter as a new terror gripped him. He demanded Sidella bring them back to the Goutway so they could be safe from the mentally ill people, or whom roamed the land of northern Goutopia, looking to dig into his life just to make fun of him and try to further ruin his life. With a look of confusion, Sidella threw his wheelchair into full throttle and pulled the overly large cart back into the Goutway. The wheels and the axles creaked under the immense weight of the gluttonous pile of putrefied pork that occupied it. With every foot they traveled, the piglet gnawed more nervously on his gouty hooves. Neither Snowcarl or Sidella knew what he was so afraid of. Being in his own kingdom, where in theory he would be surrounded by people who loved him, or at the very least were still under the pignosis. Then a horrifying snort of absolute terror erupted from the pig roach's snout. He began screaming that this was a mistake, and they had to turn away from the Goutway and move further south to a part of the road that was safer. Snowcarl was the first to see what was making him so scared. On the road there was a toll set up with a bunch of people wearing suits. As the signs of the taxings came into clear view, Snowcarl began to cackle menacingly. Yeah, plot twist, Sidella so icy. That would be a horrible plot twist. Legit, that would be a lame plot twist. Get out of here. As they inched closer to the Goutway and the toll booth they had been set up by the dreaded taxings, the fear and panic in the piglet's raspy voice increased. He let out a long string of panicked snorts, insane paranoid rambling, and flailed his noodle-like limbs about like a kite that was caught on a power line. Snowcarl stopped laughing, as he just felt embarrassed to be near the sad display of someone who he used to have people look up to him. Sidella was still pulling him towards the object of the king's neurosis fear. The piglet knew they wanted more from him because they believed he had not told the truth about his wealth, simply because he was hiding things from them. Now they were looting his kingdom by collecting a portion of the hits the piglet forces his subjects to pay. The taxings were relentless. They were even forcing the piglet to pay them every year, like it was a normal person or something. They didn't seem to understand how special and unique he was, or at least this was how the piglet felt, because he used to be known. He even claims to have been watched by some of the larger nations of the lands in YouTube. But they shunned him, because he wasn't able to keep up with the technological advances, because of the evil Tervine. As they approached the vile taxings, who wanted to take his precious money, even though, with the right tax breaks, he could probably pay less. However, he couldn't do that because the king of bankruptcy wasn't able to do things that normal people do. The cart came to a stop as the taxings had noticed them, and one of them approached the cart. The taxing had the audacity to smile and greet them. Sidella and Snowcarl returned the greeting, while the piglet simply contorted his face in shock and horror that a stranger would attempt to communicate with him, especially since it was one of the mortal enemies who was trying to ruin his life. This taxing gave the pig a suspicious look, but went on to ask them about how they were doing and where they were heading today. The piglet couldn't believe the mentally ill human would dare try and lure them into a false sense of security by being nice and engaging in the simple pleasantries that normal people do on a daily basis. After asking about their trip and giving Sidella a glittery sticker which he was infatuated with, the taxing had turned his attention to the piglet and asked the king defaulter who he was and what was his occupation. Instead of actually answering the questions, the piglet let out a snort and launched into a overly lengthy description of his legacy. The taxing said something into his collar, and another taxing came over to speak with the piglet. While he circled the cart, this taxing started to ask more probing questions to the piglet, which made him even more nervous and paranoid. The king of backbiting stumbled through his answers and said way more than he really should have. The taxings finally asked him again what his name was. Instead of answering the question, the piglet declared he was invoking his Fourth Amendment rights. The taxings responded by saying they weren't trying to search and seize his property, unless he was a former king of Goutopia, who they had a legal claim to do so. Because of the extreme debt the beggar king was in, Sidella, with a giant smile on his face, gleefully declared the piglet was the king of salt, the lord of Snort, the archduke of Gout, and the first king of Goutopia. With a look of horror on his snout, the piglet stared at his last cultist. Snowcarl nearly fell from the cart after doubling over with laughter. The taxings thanked Sidella for his honesty and gave him another glittery sticker. They then seized the love seat and tossed his atrophied carcass of the piglet back into the cart and wished them a safe journey. Snowcarl continued to mock the piglet, who lay in a catatonic state after losing his treasured love seed. Sidella continued on down the Goutway with a stupid grin on his face, not realizing that what he had done to the piglet. Why did he put the tree like it should be the three? The three continued along the Goutway after an encounter with the taxing's toll that had been set up to pay off the astronomical debt the beggar king had accumulated during his sad life. The pig roach was catatonic in the cart after being forced to give up his love seed, being sold out by his most loyal cultist, and also coming into contact with another person. Snowcarl was sitting in the cart, giggling at the state of the piglet. Without even trying, he appeared he appeared this last tragedy had broken something inside the bloated, gout-filled, gelatinous septic tank the piglet calls a body. Even though its deteriorated eyes looked like they had looked like the life had fled from them, his twisted brain slowly rationalizing what had happened to him. Snowcarl moved past what was mentally and physically left of the King of Sloth and Gluttony to the front of the cart, so he could speak to Sidella, the captain of the Participation Award-winning Goutopian cavalry was still infatuated with the 2 glittery stickers that the taxing had given him. Snowcarl tried to explain to him that they really didn't need to head to this rune in Bridgefort, just because the piglet told them to. Sidella just stared at the stickers as his wheelchair was set to full throttle and crept down the only paved road in all of Goutopia, both north and south. After an hour of trying to get his attention, Snowcarl just gave up and went back into looking at what was left of the former white-hot popular slug that fell into begging and finally into the dark clown of the world. Alright, I need to take a sip. I am okay, right? Like, I'm not too overbearing, right? I'm not like, I'm at a decent level. I know we're like almost an hour in, but I'm just making sure we're all hanging in here. Beautiful. Okay. Oh man, this was the best decision to do the little beanbag chair. This is fucking great. I can feel comfortable while doing this retarded read. For some reason that we will never know, the pig roach leapt to his hind hooves and screamed from the top of his undeveloped lungs that this was Tevin's fault, and followed that up with a thunderous angry snort. He began to rock back and forth furiously, mumbling about how various slights he had suffered from how one day he was going to be bigger, stronger, and they will all be sorry for pointing out all the stupid, racist, hurtful things that escaped his worm-like lips. The piglet ran his grimy hooves through the thinning oil slick he calls hair, and declared they must head to the pleasure gardens, which should be nearby. With a shudder, Snowcarl regretfully asked what the point was of the side mission. And why did he have the pleasure gardens? After saying that, Snowcarl threw up a bit. The king of excessive spending explained that this was where all of his accomplishments were housed, as well as a bunch of other things to aid in his recovery. Sidella still stayed his course because he wasn't listening due to the glittery stickers and how the sunlight was bouncing off them and making rainbows. DSP threw something at him, cleared his throat, and angrily snorted at Sidella, who immediately turned, but not knowing what he had done wrong. The King of Tall Tales continued to hype up this place, where they would be able to rest, relax. Everything that they could ever want was located in this place, and it was the best place in all of Goutopia. Snowcarl questioned if this place had so many riches, or was extravagant as they were told, and wasn't it plundered by either taxing or the Catzonians? The piglet glared at him and screamed about how that was it. Snowcarl was now banned. His gnarled, gouty hoof swung down and came in contact with the cart. A sinister grin crept across Snowcarl's face as he gleefully pointed out that the ban button was taken with his coveted love seat. The pig roach's snout contorted into one of terror as it dawned on his only real protection from the mentally ill humans that had been stripped from him. He couldn't ban Snowcarl. He couldn't ban anyone now. And his precious ban button was gone. The piglet was now largely defenseless, aside from the layer of grease and his several layers of fat that protected his strained black heart. The cackling only grew more intense as they moved along the Goutway on their journey to his former palace in Bridgeport. Even though the city was said to have been destroyed by the king of backbiting, fleeing that place once it became clear to him that the vile Howard and turned John of Rambo against him. The piglet sat like a rotting carcass on the plains of fear of someone attacking him, or mocking his noodle arms, or pointing out that the oil slick hair on his head was thinning, or that he hadn't seen the sun in decades. Oh, dude. Okay, yeah. The unlikely trio locked on as the motor on Seidella's wheelchair was starting to break down, and he had to start using his arms to move them along. The icy claw of fear released its grip for just long enough for the piglet to complain about how long this was taking, that his juice box of cherry juice was empty, and he was all out of goldfish crackers. Previously, he had complained about his crackers being whole grain, so it says Sono Carl. How'd you get that wrong? Told they weren't, and because the piglet is gullible, he believed him. Seidella attempted to double his efforts, however, being only one person, it was all he could do to get them to their destination faster. A shrill squeal escaped the piglet's worm-like lips, and he began prancing about the cart with the excitement of a toddler who was told they could stop for ice cream. The piglet began flailing his noodle arms about and demanding that they stop at his pleasure gardens, which were only a few hundred feet away. So Carl asked why they couldn't see them, since they were only a few hundred feet away. Since this was in a flat plain, there was no buildings in sight. DSP informed Snow Carl that he was being a brain-dead idiot and a complete moron for not believing him. Upon hearing all of this, Seidella started to move off the Goutway, and the piglet unleashed an angry snort and told him it was on the other side of the road. In response to this, Seidella moved to the other side of the road and pulled over. Snow Carl again pointed out there was nothing here, and this was a waste of time, much like the pig roach's life. Ignoring this, the pig roach leaped from the cart and immediately twisted both of his stick-like legs, landing face first in the mud, and began to silently weep. He rubbed the mud, blood, and grease from his snout and scampered towards a few piles of stone, a ruined gate, and a large plaque with a sign taped to it. He swung his jowls around wildly, looking for something that no one else could see. Finally, he stumbled down in front of the plaque and started wailing about how the detractors ruined his life, also demanding someone read the signs to him because his eyes were sore. Snow Carl appeared behind the piglet and began to read the plaque. The plaque told him that this was the great pleasure gardens of Goutopia. Bask in the majestic gardens, drink from the lake of gin, play in the grand arcade games, all of which were Street Fighter II Turbo, and donate to DSP's PayPal. The sign taped to it informed everyone who stopped there that the taxing and the other collection companies had reclaimed everything of value here. So Carl looked at these two things with a questioning expression on one face. He asked the piglet why he needed a lake filled with gin. The piglet exclaimed, through sniffles, about how he needed the gin lake for his business, and it helped him to forget about all the bad things people did to him. So Carl rolled his eyes and asked why he only had one type of arcade cabinet. The pig roach exclaimed that the 500 Street Fighter cabinets were business related, and he needed them in case he wanted to play all of the same games more than once. The girl thought about explaining why that was dumb, but just told the piglet everything here was gone, and they should just go. After a series of depressed snorts, DSP waddled back to his cart, and they continued their journey. A dejected pig, his dullard, and Snow Carl continued down the Goutway. After visiting the ruins of DSP's former pleasure gardens, the piglet had either forgotten or just didn't want to remember the place that had been ravaged by the taxing's invasion. They had plundered the gardens and used the proceeds to pay for mountain of debt the king of foreclosure had accrued during his sad life. It wasn't his fault, though. He did everything correctly. Everything he did was right. He didn't do anything wrong. Unless he was wrong. The piglet let those thoughts roll around in the deteriorating brain which was swimming in gin and failure. Doubt was slowly creeping in about how he was probably not doing something right. But that couldn't be it. The piglet couldn't possibly be the one who was wrong. It had to be the detractors, the taxings, the Twitch sirens, and life itself, which were all conspiring against him. A subtle bump in the road caused the king of inebriation to lose his train of thought. Snapping back to the harsh reality he lived in, the piglet started to rage about how reckless Seidella was being while pulling the royal cart to their destination. It's audible as fire. Oh shit. Glad you're liking it. Slowly the piglet realized they had reached the valley which separates North and South Goutopia. Nothing was there was a long line of people waiting to flee from north to south, and hopefully to a better place in one of the many kingdoms of YouTube. After a minute of waiting, the entitled pig began to huff and stamp his gout-infested foot. This childish outburst caught the attention of some of those around them and the guards. The king of entitlement demanded the other people waiting in line to move aside like logical humans so he can continue to his destination. Because he was in a hurry. Some of the people gave him sideways glances and went back to what they were doing. The odd event was just the start of it. The piglet continued to complain to everyone around him how they were ruining Christmas. His parents were dying, and he had to get there before they died. He had cancer and needed treatment, and finally, his time was more important. After close to 30 minutes one of the people turned around and told the piglet to shut the hell up. And they were all waiting, and he wasn't any better or more important than anyone else. This shocked the piglet. How dare these people talk the way they do to him? The piglet huffed and snorted, clearing his throat, and asked them if they knew who he was. This had gathered the attention of all the people around him, as he wanted to find out who this physically embodiment of a failure was, and what he was going to say. An uneasy silence settled over the section of the Goutway, and as the piglet was waiting for someone to guess who fathered this sentient blob of gout. Finally, someone explained that they didn't know why the piglet, was? You mean who? They didn't know who the piglet was. Dude, come on. The piglet's mouth flopped open as his brain tried to process the idea of no one knowing who he was, especially in Goutopia. The other people on the road asked him if he was anyone that mattered. Instead of responding to this, he just slumped down in the cart as people began to lose interest in him all over again. He saw his life repeat itself as he slowly relived failure after failure, all inspired by this one instance. The three of them slowly moved through the line and crossed into southern Goutopia, with the piglet in an utmost catatonic state. This is art. I don't know if this could be considered art. It's something. I don't really know if this is art. It kills me because I'm trying to read it as it is, but because it has so many like weird grammatical errors and like it's clear spelling errors, and then they just change the words to other words because I guess spell check must have thought it was a different word. It'll say like why instead of who, and shit doesn't make sense when I read it out loud. I'm like, wait a minute, this didn't sound right. Yeah, let me take another sip. How many pages we got? Oh wow, we're fucking flying through this. The three of them moved south through the gate, through the pass separating north and south of Goutopia. In this section, the Goutway was still paved, but it was slowly narrowing due to a lack of investment by the beggar king, who had abandoned this part of his kingdom long ago. The cataclysm that took place in the north wasn't repeated here, as it was outside the reach of the Twitch sirens. The taxings also ignored it because there was no need to pillage this place. South Goutopia was a brighter place, a less salty place, a place mostly depopulated during the Goutopian Civil War and the Piglet's exodus after his failed show project of Project 7. DSP would occasionally wander into this land just to see what his enemies were saying about him. He also had to pass through here to get to the war zone of Bridgeport, where his parents lived and where his former palace is. The catatonic piglet hadn't moved or spoken since he was confronted by the people who didn't know who he was, and with his ban button gone, there was no way for him to protect himself. In his twisted mind, the piglet was desperately trying to rationalize, and he was trying to rationalize us as he was someone like 15 years ago. Why couldn't they remember his exploits at EVO qualifiers? Or that time he tried to exploit a port of Street Fighter 2? Normally, his pignosis would have turned some of them to his side, but hadn't happened. Meanwhile, Snowcarl was getting bored as he couldn't torment the piglet while he was in this state. Instead, he started to talk with Sidella, who was still infatuated with his glittery stickers. Every once in a while, Sidella would unleash a chain of racist crap as he passed by some of the people touring the abandoned parts of South Goutopia. Snowcarl didn't defend him or back him up because that wouldn't be funny. These wanderers would confront Sidella, and the participation award-winning captain of the Goutopian cavalry would immediately back down out of fear of being beaten up. Sidella tried to use these instances as a way to gain sympathy, but Snowcarl wasn't really buying it, and pointed out that they were just like the piglet. Pointed out that, just like the piglet, many of his problems were his own fault. He continued by saying if Sidella didn't change his ways, he would end up mentally broken like the piglet. Sidella couldn't see a problem with this, because the pignosis was so ingrained in him that the sad little thing couldn't understand what personal responsibilities and consequences were. As they were talking, a terrifying snort torn through the air, followed by a belch and a throat clear. Snowcarl turned to see the twisted image of the King of Infamy looking at the world around him. The piglet's jowls swung wildly as he looked around at this place. He was clearly frightened by the sight of the outside world. The piglet wailed about how he needed protection from the sun, and this air was making his back hurt. After staring at the piglet for a moment, Snowcarl explained that the reason why the piglet's back hurt was because he was fat and never worked out or attempted to work out. This news shocked the piglet, and he bellowed his trademark, "What?" It could have just said, "This shocks me." The piglet had seemed to sober up and realize he was outside in a scary place. They had journeyed from the ruins of the swine fort, or what was left of it, after the years of ignoring the problems it and the taxings who pillaged it for the riches the pig was hoarding. The King of Sloth's jowls swung about wildly. As a slightly less drunk piglet tried to figure out what had happened. He could have asked one of his companions, but they were beneath him, according to the twisted logic in the pig's gin-fueled mind. The icy grip of fear was squeezing around the piglet's underdeveloped, blackened, and possibly diseased heart. He was hyperventilating, snorting at a truly disturbing rate, and his sickly body was producing grease at a disturbing rate. Snowcarl and Sidella looked at this sad image, while Snowcarl looked at it and felt about like the piglet was just looking for a way to abandon his stupid quest. He made them go on. Sidella was having an internal battle with the image of the beggar king and the pignosis had placed in his mind and what his eyes were seeing, while Snowcarl was content to let the king of deficit throw his temper tantrum and eventually burn his latest mental breakdown, out. And come on. Just eventually burnt out on his latest mental breakdown. Sidella took a different approach. Something was snapping inside his childlike mind, and he tried the useless and possibly broken down body of the pig to the chair, and maybe that meant tied. Yeah. He tied the useless and possibly broken down body of the pig to his wheelchair and started to drag the piglet's gout and gin-riddled body towards the south. DSP squealed about the ground was hurting his paper-thin hide. The rope was hurting his back, his ear was hurting, and he spilled his cherry juice. And the people were going to make fun of him if they saw this sad scene. Is this a horror story? I mean, it might as well be. It kind of is, in a weird way. Oh, we swapped back to that. We need to keep it on fucking Skyrim, damn it. Always going to be Skyrim. This is a sad tale. We have to remain in sadness. Like for the whole fucking 2 hours that I gotta read this. Let's see. Snowcarl was fighting back laughter as he explained to the piglet how everyone already treated him like a laughingstock that he was. This hurt the piglet's feelings, or at least the few feelings he had left. Snowcarl saw this and continued to needle the pig roach with different things people say about him. Finally, the record of Pig's fighting games accomplishments was brought up. Snowcarl pointed out how the piglet lost at Evo, and the king of PS1 Street Fighter snorted in rage at someone pointing out his faults, at the only game he's averaged to above average, and declared he was the best North American player in 2005. This didn't impress Snow Carl, or anyone else that pointed out to the pig roach that he lost. DSP explained he didn't lose, he took 4th place, to which Snow Carl repeated that it wasn't first, so he lost. The rage was building in the piglet as he was being dragged across the ground by Sidella in his wheelchair. The piglet unleashed a thunderous snort and declared Snow Carl to be a brain-dead detractor and called on his mods to drop the banhammer. Snow Carl looked around confidently as the three slowly made their way across the southern Goutopia, on their way to the mythic city of Bridgeport, where the lost palace of DSP was supposed to be. As nothing happened, the rage and salt melted from his droopy face of the piglet, and ever-present fear crept back in. In a very confident and mocking tone, Snow Carl asked if there were any mods here, knowing full well there weren't any mods anymore, and the magical ban button had been taken away from the piglet. There was no way for the piglet to actually ban him, and even if he did, Snow Carl could just come back in any form he chose. The piglet's fear turned to despair, which turned into a bottle of gin. The piglet didn't respond to Snow Carl and just started nursing a bottle of gin. He seemed to just manifest out of thin air, which kind of surprised Snow Carl, who wondered why the king of Tanqueray didn't just keep doing that and sell the bottles. However, he remembered who he was, and with something that made sense would be too hard for the piglet. The piglet continued to pout and nurse his bottle of gin as he was being pulled by Sidella. Snow Carl walked alongside them, constantly pointing out the many failures of the king of mismanagement, while they traveled through the ruins of South Goutopia. This place had been abandoned long ago by the Beggar King. Few buildings were still standing here, but it did not escape the many invasions which the North had to suffer, as more and more empires realized it was largely defenseless. Snow Carl asked the piglet about how the first queen of Goutopia was able to escape his kingdom. The king of narcissism avoided the question, so he could tell a story about himself, the struggles he had undergone, and why his life was so hard. Prepare for the pig's tale about the world being against him, etc. Okay. With a depressing story and a vomit-inducing throat clear, the piglet started his fairy tale of sorrow, sadness, salt, and lies. He started with his bullshit by telling him it all began with the evil one, AJ, who had the gall to point out his failure, which led to the counter cult of Kojima to rise up and hurt him, not with sticks or stones, but with their words. They cut deeply into the paper hide and grease and blubber that attempted to protect him. They created a name for him like pig, cult leader, pig roach, liar, e-beggar, thought, scammer, thief, loser, hypochondriac, blind, gout-ridden, bloated corpse, horse thief, child lover, and many more, all of which the piglet claimed were untrue and slanderous. It was at this point Snow Carl asked him why he didn't try to take the legal action against them, or present evidence to the contrary. The piglet called him stupid and just kept talking. Snow Carl rolled his eyes and listened to some more of the piglet's ramblings. He continued to say more people hurt him and ruined his life, which chased him from South Goutopia. Annoyed by this, Snow Carl reminded the piglet his question was about the Queen of Soap Panda from Not Asia, which led to the question of where the piglet thought she was from, since her name would suggest an Asian heritage. A vein began to grow in the piglet's ever-expanding forehead as the constant interruptions to at this point were grinding away on the nerves of the pig. Not the ones in his spine with a severely herniated disc or a pulled muscle. In a sad attempt to ignore the questions, DSP continued with his life, explaining how he created a grand archive to continue to have a presence in southern Goutopia, to allow his cultists here to continue their worship of him. The statement caused Snow Carl to retch into wait, what? You meant reach into a pocket, take out a bottle of aspirin, and pop the 2 pills into his mouth. He closed his eyes and wished the pills would act faster than normal. Then he looked around at the encroaching forest and began to slowly clap in the most mocking way he could possibly. Carl then proceeded to say, the piglet did a wonderful job of maintaining his presence in this abandoned forest that was once South Goutopia, and marveled at the imaginary monuments to the pig's greatness fawning over the glorious architecture in this place devoid of a human presence, the lavishing fake praise on how he managed to keep this place looking like a very modern city. Eventually the piglet erupted into a childlike temper tantrum. His noodle limbs flailed about wildly, and his enraged snorts were broken up by the unintelligible rants of a 4-year-old who had refused to understand why he couldn't have the candy for breakfast. This continued for about 5 minutes before he ran out of lung capacity and started to gasp for air. So Carl just smiled, knowing that he had gotten under the paper-thin hide of the piglet and forced it to lash out in one of the more pathetic displays of the elderly pig's life. Suddenly they came to a stop, and through the pig's watery eyes he saw what he had been hoping for. With a squeal that was a mix of fear, paranoia, and happiness, he pointed his gnarled gouty hoof at a large sign which read Bridgeport, next exit. Oh man. It's kind of weird. I wonder when this was written. Because I guess it must have been right after Anonymous left. But I don't know why, just thinking about Snow Carl being like this dude who's tricking people. Like, he's the fucking Loki of this universe. He's like, dude, you can't trust these guys. They're all stupid. He's the scorpion on the fucking frog's back. He's the actual fucking scorpion. If this turns into a dark smut fanfic, I'm noping out. Kate, we do have one fanfic later in, and I think it might have smut. So just a heads up. This one is pretty clean because it's written by Paul Werkema, and I don't think he has any smut anywhere here. But I mean, just a forewarning. But we are doing that next, so just a heads up. Don't call Kate Winslet a coward. Kate Winslet is a fucking treasure. Okay? Don't you dare make fun of Kate. Tears of liquid gout rolled down the piglet's snout and added more stains to his disgusting white t-shirt, which probably hadn't been changed in weeks. The joy of returning to the place he once called home was quickly replaced with the fear of running into one of the many people who had felt they were wronged by the piglet. Of course, he had done nothing wrong. The tales of him exploiting his friends, not paying them for work they had done, the lies about them not wanting money, the other lies about how they had a meeting about DSP getting all the money, and the other lies about other things that were made up. Unless you look at all of the well-documented things the piglet had said. What? Unless you had... Oh. Okay. Why even add that line? Killing me, Smalls. The broken down body of the piglet began to produce grease at a pace not seen in many years. The fear was really having an effect on him. So Carl noticed this and had pondered why this was happening now, when the pig seemed so convinced that this was what he needed to do. This was probably the only time he had seen his piglet showing this type of fear. As he continued to wonder what was going on with the pig, a strange sound came from the distance. At the sound of this, the piglet began to furiously shake all over, which flung some of the grease off of DSP. It was really gross. Seriously. It was absolutely vile. So Carl moved further away from the piglet, which only seemed to make the shaking more violent. Like the king of cowards could feel the absence of people around him. The piglet's head swung wildly back and forth, looking for something that he believed was waiting for a moment of weakness. I guess a moment of even more weakness, or the perception of the pig not being able to realize what's happening. The three of them moved into the city. One thing became perfectly clear. There was nothing really wrong with this place. It wasn't the crime-infested hellscape the piglet had portrayed in each of his many speeches concerning this place. There were no bodies in the streets, no random people injecting innocent people with heroin, no roving bands of hoodlums. None of the abandoned buildings or crack houses which he had repeatedly mentioned. It was almost like this was just a regular city that could be found anywhere in the United States. Without warning, the piglet began yanking on the rope around his rotund waist. and aggressively gestured at a nearby house. Snowcarl looked over and saw the source of the piglet's distress was an average-looking black man mowing his lawn and occasionally yelling at his neighbor who was planting flowers. The two of them appeared to be complaining about the rules of their HOA, as well as the need to run in the next election so they could stop the unnecessary fines for having the doors painted the wrong shade of blue. The king of paranoia let out a terrified squeal and escaped his worm-like lips, which was enough to catch their attention. The two looked over at the sorry state of DSP. The piglet and his companions, they waved, and the black man mowing his lawn even greeted him by calling him Little Davy and asked about his parents. Aww, Little Davy. They all seemed to know the piglet and greeted him. The townspeople were asking about his parents, his job, and how his wife was doing. Sometimes they would get the names of the former queens of Goutopia mistaken, which would cause Snowcarl to snicker and the king of Gout to tremble in anger. The piglet thought about reacting in anger, but he didn't have the safety in being responding. What? He didn't have the safety of being able to respond on the internet? I think that's what is meant. Now there was a huge chance of being physically confronted with the stupid crap the piglet would spew from his sewer-like mouth. Snowcarl complimented the neighborhood as being a very nice one, where everyone looked happy. The piglet just grumbled about how it was a terrible place, filled with the mentally ill people who kept holding him back from achieving his greatness. This is when DSP launched into another long and rambling monologue about how he was always being screwed over by everyone around him. He basically went into full-on pre-stream mode by recounting his entire history since losing his job at the helicopter company to now. Somewhere in the middle of all of this, Snowcarl asked if it was the same helicopter company that he was fired from for being a useless drunk. Rage built up in Piglet's tummy as he let out a thunderous snort and bellowed that Snowcarl was wrong as he began aggressively rocking side to side, chastising his tormentor. One of these people in the neighborhood rushed out to him with a weighted vest and put it on the piglet. With this mystical vest on, the king of temper tantrums immediately calmed down. The neighbor thanked Snowcarl for helping the piglet get back home and mentioned how his parents were worried about him since his financial troubles and divorces. After exchanging pleasantries, the three of them continued down the road. This wasn't the same ruined post-apocalypse hellscape that was described by the piglet. From the tales of this place, Snowcarl was expecting a dystopian environment where no one was allowed to do anything or go anywhere. And every day there were pitched battles between the various races who were being armed by the government based on the piglet's lies. One would think this entire place was really a psychological experiment to see what would happen when society breaks down. After a long walk, they made it to their destination. The first swine fort was just a few hundred feet away. As they closed in on it, the piglet began to wail and tug on the rope. The fear building up inside the gout-ridden body of the piglet was too much for him and his vest to contain. With great effort, more effort than the piglet spent on WWE champions, it was able to tip over Idela's wheelchair. Snowcarl asked the piglet what he was doing, and that you should never do something like that. Through the sounds of the snorty protests for the piglet, the wheelchair was righted. Finally, Snowcarl spotted the image of his piglet's fear. While he didn't know who the person was, he did know that this wasn't John of Rambo. It wasn't someone who the king of exploitation had used and tossed away long ago. With the piglet frantically trying to stop their advance, the three of them closed the distance, where within earshot of this person who had made the piglet terrified, a flurry of panicked snorts was followed by the flailing noodle arms of the king of atrophy, lashing out in anger at both Snowcarl and Idela. He raged at the both of them and demanded an end to this death march they were forcing him to go on. In response, Snowcarl leaned in and told him that this was all the piglet's doing. DSP had to have known this was waiting for him. He had not constantly sent drunken texts to his former friends, this person wouldn't be here now. Fear paralyzed the piglet as he reached the driveway in the first swine fort. The man sitting on the front step waiting for them grinned and stood up. He held out the coveted Tomes of Goutopia and asked if these were what DSP were looking for. Through gouty tears, the piglet whimpered, and none of what happened was his fault. He needed what was in the tomes to regain his kingdom. The man cackled at this and asked what happened to the King of Hate. The pig roach, who once talked aggressively to those on SRK and ruled an imaginary kingdom through lies and fear. What would the cult of the pig say if they could see him now? What would John of Rambo say? With a few remaining discs in the piglet's spine that hadn't been herniated yet, the king of enfeeblement mustered the little pride he had and tried to stand up for himself. His worm-like lips contorted into a rapey grin, and he threatened to dox this person. It didn't work. The person let out another cackle and told the piglet to go right ahead, as everyone knew his name, and it was Howard. With this, the only thing the piglet thought he could use against the foe was stripped away. The king of cowardice immediately emptied his bladder in fear and tried to tell Howard that he was only joking, and that he could always go back to making good videos together, just like the good old days. Howard looked at the pig roach in disgust as he tried to remember the good times. He told the pig the good times were over, but if he didn't want to get the beating he deserved, he had to give Howard his cut of Project 7. More gouty tears streamed down the drooping cheeks of the piglet as he tried to say he had no money. But if he could get the Tomes of Goutopia, then he could get the money he was owed, Howard. His former friend looked at him and immediately saw through the tears and the lies and knew the money would never be paid. Instead, Howard told the piglet he didn't have to worry about paying him back. Joy flickered in the pig roach's deteriorating eyes at the sound of not having to pay anyone. The piglet quickly tried to turn his perceived win into his advantage, and demanded not only the Tomes of Goutopia, but also the arcade board he claimed Howard stole from him. Instead of even entertaining this, Howard told the piglet if he wanted something from him, the piglet would need to do more than give Howard his cut of the riches for Project 7. If the pig roach wanted the arcade board as well, he would have to pay OJ the money he was owed as well. The piglet protested and claimed OJ didn't want the money, as he was paid with exposure. Howard rolled his eyes and told the pig he was only getting the Tomes of Goutopia back with no questions asked. If he wanted the board back, they could talk about it another time. DSP struggled to get to his knees and started thanking Howard for being so generous and a great friend. Howard smiled and produced a lighter from his pocket and held the tomes over it. The joy was replaced by panic, which turned into desperation. The piglet begged Howard not to do what he was going to do, but it had no effect on his friend turned enemy. The flames from the lighter licked the salted pages of the tome and slowly caught it on fire. It was dropped to the ground, and all the piglet could do was watch it as his hopes and dreams were reduced to ashes before him. Once the fire was out, Snowcrawl scooped up a handful of the ashes and held it to the pig roach and asked him if he still wanted the tome. The piglet looked up at the grinning face of Snowcrawl and attempted to slap his hand away. None of the wild flailing of the pig roach hooves came close to Snowcrawl's hands. Slowly thought the wind blew away the ashes of the tome. With it, any hopes of recreating the salt and gout stones were gone forever. The pathetic piglet plopped down on the ground in despair. Snowcrawl danced around him, laughed, and needling the piglet with verbal barbs about how his life amounted to failure. As a rage built up in the piglet, he was knocked off his rotund behind from a furious punch from Howard. Upon seeing this, Sidella giggled, and Snowcrawl's maniacal laugh echoed off in the pristine buildings of Bridgeport. It was at this time Howard informed the piglet that he had live-streamed all of this, so all of the few remaining cult members would be able to see what had befallen the piglet. Another and much more violent wave of terror torn through the piglet, sending him into another catatonic state as his brain attempted to process this. Howard walked over to him, took the last bottle of gin from his gouty, gnarled hooves of the piglet, and smashed it on the ground. He then punched the piglet again in his haggard and pasty face. The king of vitamin D deficiency snapped too and attempted to scamper away as quickly as his noodle legs could carry him. His underdeveloped lungs burned as they tried to, in vain, to bring in air needed to keep up the pig's frantic pace. DSP could feel the ligaments in his knees strained to the point of tearing. The pain in his muscles as they tried to respond to the panicked messages from his gin-addled brain. His joints creaked and popped as he tried to shake off years of inactivity and the gout crystals that called his legs home, tearing into the soft paper-thin skin. After 10 feet, he collapsed onto the ground, struggling to breathe. The snorts became quicker and more frantic as the pig's post-nasal drip took a toll on his respiratory system. Howard, Snowcarl, and Sidella just looked at the sorry state of the piglet was in. It only took 2 punches and a burned set of books to break the little confidence of the piglet. Howard turned to the other two and told them he was now done with the pig, as he had gotten as much as he wanted, as was probably possible. They wished Howard well as he walked off into the distance to continue his life without having to deal with the pig ever again. Snowcarl told Sidella he was free now to go and do whatever he wanted, but should probably apologize for all the stupid things he said to people over the years. In a meek voice, Sidella asked if people will forgive him, and Snowcarl said that most probably won't, and that he should probably be prepared to just accept it. With that, Sidella wheeled away to follow his own path. Hopefully he unlearns the lessons the piglet taught him. Finally, Snowcarl walked over to the piglet, who was still lying face down, gasping for air. He knelt down and thought about his whole odd journey that they had went on, and how nothing really changed as far as he could tell. Looking down at the sorry state of the piglet, he told him how he wondered if the pig would take this as a sign of how he needed to change his ways. That in the end, the pig will most likely fall back on his old ways. The piglet muttered in his responses, saying how he will one day be back because you can't stop the greed and the gout which he feeds on. The pig lashed out. And Snowcarl Blood simply? Okay. Blood simply fell through him as the image of his tormentor flickered like a hologram. DSP looked at him in confusion as Snowcarl explained how he was never really here. And just like one of his many sock accounts that follow the pig, and it's just a shadow. Snowcarl faded away as his laugh continued to ring into the gouty ears of the piglet's infected ears. Now he was alone, far from the ruins of his home, sitting in front of the first palace, looking for the for sale sign that Midfirst Bank had put outside of it. While the piglet was sat on the street, pondering how this could be blamed on Tervine, and what he was going to do now, a thought entered his gin-fueled brain. How was Snowcarl able to physically interact with him? With those ashes, if he was a hologram? It didn't make any sense to him. What happened to that Anonymous? And how come he didn't come back after being banned like everyone else seemed to? What happened to his cart? And how was he going to get back home? Why did Tervine do all of this? The questions and more probably won't be answered. The end. You know, that wasn't a terrible read. We had a thing. It was a beginning, middle, and end. There was a coherent story. Oh man. Yeah, that was halfway decent. I could feel the tism in all of that. It was the best waste of $8. No, wait. Yeah, it was $8. Because it was like fucking $5 plus shipping. But the best $8 I've ever wasted on like a fucking collection of posts. And to think that there are 2 other books that are just like hiding out there.